This podcast is sponsored by Teens and Youth in Leadership, CYIL Africa, an organization that is committed to raising generations of young leaders across Africa. Our programs include leadership education, leadership fellowship, research training, webinars, and conferences. Stay informed of our programs by following us on LinkedIn at CYIL and at CYIL Africa on Instagram.
Hello, my name is Israel Idari. I'm a social scientist and a pragmatist. As a social scientist, my research is focused on understanding how youth develop leadership to make social change within their communities and immediate environment. I'd like to invite you to this podcast where I interview and have conversations with scholars and practitioners on their perspective on leadership, followership, and social change. I hope you truly learn from this podcast. Have fun. Again, I am so happy to have Maike. Maike is a professor of human resource management. She's from Germany, and I know that she has a lot that she does with followership, both research and practice. And I'm so excited to have you today, Maike.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so today I want us to talk about followership in Germany, and I did a little research over the weekend, and I would like to read something from that research, and that can start off our conversation. So what I saw was that Germany has a very strict set of cultural and social norms, do and do not do. They said that this translates into leadership as they have a performance-oriented mindset and they avoid uncertainty at all costs. All right, so that was my finding from my little research. What do you think is the state of followership in Germany?
So that's a really interesting quote. So you are right with the quote that we have a lot of rules. And when you look at the term to follow in German, you mostly don't use it with people. So you don't follow people. But what you follow is signposts, rules, instructions. So we use that a lot with rather objects than people. And I think that's something that's rooted in culture. And at the same time, you don't really have to adhere to these rules. So it's a choice. So there are quite a lot of rules that you can follow, but you can also choose not to.
Thank you so much for that response. All right, so I'm going to ask some personal question. How did, the love for followership start for you? How did you begin your followership research? And coming from Germany, I don't know much about Germany, but did staying there or growing there influence any of your love for followership?
So I came across followership through my PhD. So I started my PhD, and then at some point I wanted to change my topic because what I first did was about employee retention, and there was so much research on that already that I was like, okay, I need something else. It's a bit more interesting. Then I more or less stumbled over followership. And it's really interesting because there's not much with a German background on followership. So I know there's one other professor who's looking into it, but it's not their main focus. And I think the reason for that is that we don't have a term for followership. So if you want to translate it and put it into a dictionary, then it says weird things that which are mostly outdated terms. So, for example, you can have something that's more political or refers to ideologies, but it's a very specific term. Or you're a supporter, but that's more used in terms of sports. So we don't have a single term for followers or followership. And I think that's one reason why the concept hasn't been explored in that cultural context yet.
Thank you so much. So, do you think that followership is a thing in Germany? Now, not in terms of the term. I grew up in Nigeria and people place a lot of emphasis on leadership, but they also place emphasis on followership in the sense that if the country is not doing well, they don't just blame the leaders, they also blame that, followers are not probably voting. We have citizenship studies as well in Africa and in Nigeria. So, do you think people pay attention to followership as a practice?
I think as a people, we are very aware of followership because when you go back about 100 years, people voted for the guy who became quite a dictator here. So the question is always like, why didn't people notice what was happening? And why did everybody say they didn't know about concentration camps and stuff like that? So I think that's where we are very aware of what followership can do and that it's necessary for leadership to have an impact. And at the same time, when we look at politics at the moment, I'd say that as a people, we are very enduring. So we can take a lot until we speak up.
Mm.
And that's what we can currently see because there's so much going on in terms of discussions, but the whole system is still holding. And I think that's an interesting combination that we have a sense of what followership is and what it can do, also negative impact it can have, but it's not something we talk about a lot.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much. I believe that, from what you have said, followership is something that people do, but it's not something that people really think about that they do. So, do you think that there is a strong divide between leadership and followership in Germany? What I mean is that do you think that there are power structures in Germany that usually influence how people perceive leaders versus how they perceive followers?
That's an interesting question. And I would say that, especially in terms of business leaders, there's a shift at the moment because many young people don't want to become managers anymore. So they might want to be leaders in a certain way. So they want to influence others, but they find other ways to do that. So I'd say that having a management position isn't as much a goal as it used to be for young people. So when I talk to students, many of them say, I see how much my parents and that generation invested and what it did to their health, to how they now live. And so they have different goals. They want to have they want to make a good living, but not necessarily through a management position. And they have other means of being impactful. And I think that's very interesting to see because when you go maybe 20 years back, the only way to be influential in an organization was to become a manager. And that's definitely changing.
Yeah, thank you so much. So power is actually decentralized. So do you think that there is a structure for teaching or educating people about good followership in Germany at the moment? It could be formal or informal.
Mhm. As we don't have a term for it, I think it's really hard to do. So when I talk to my students about followership, I often ask them like, so what would you call the concept? And we're all having a really hard time finding terms for that. What I would say is that we've got quite good means to teach young people how to be a good member of a group. And maybe that's the closest to followership. So in schools nowadays, not many years ago, but now when I look at school children, I know what they tell me is that they also have to evaluate themselves in how good do I fit into the group? Am I a good member of the group? What am I contributing? And probably that's the closest that we can get to followership without giving it a name.
Yeah, thank you. So have you conducted any research that's focused on followership in Germany. I know that during the last International Leadership Association, I attended your session and I really enjoyed what you said about the different connotations people have about followership. But do you have any research that is related to followership that has been conducted in Germany?
Well, actually, my PhD, which
Please, yeah,
hasn't been fully published yet, so I'm still working on that. And something I found in that research was also what I mentioned earlier, that when you ask people, so I asked them for voluntary behavior, they showed that contributes to the goals of an organization or another person. So that was the workaround I used because I didn't have a term for followership.
yeah,
And a lot of them talked about not following a person, but following a goal. And it was a common goal that in the end helped the organization or the person, but it was mostly indirect. And that's what I think is very culture specific and would be interesting to see if other cultures have more direct ways of following, because
mhm,
ours seems to be indirect.
mm,
And I don't think there's much out there. There are some aspects of fellowship explored in Germany, but it's mostly when you look at followers as employees. So if you look at more distinguished types of followership, so when you say followership is not necessarily being an employee, but you can be a follower in other roles too. So it's not linked to hierarchy necessarily, then it becomes a bit more complex. And I think that part hasn't been explored in Germany, but it hasn't in most of the world.
yeah. Thank you so much. I have two more questions. You mentioned, direct and indirect following. So, do you think indirect following in Germany has created lots of balance to power and productivity across organizations and even the societies? Then, similar to that question, I wanted to ask about followers' voice. Barbara Kellerman, in her book, The End of Leadership, wrote about how that followers are beginning to speak out, the era of unionization. Do you think that's a thing in Germany where followers speak out, where they make their voice known and talk to leaders and make sure that leaders see that this is what we're fighting for?
So I think we've got a bit of a different situation here in Germany because we've been having unions and work councils since the 70s. So it's quite common. Every larger organization has a works council. It's just something you have, and there's laws for that. So employers can't just say, oh, I don't want one. So
Mhm.
I think when we're socialized in a work environment, that's something we get to know pretty early. So that's always somewhere you can go. You can ask questions that you might not want to discuss with your manager first. And works councils have quite a lot of power in Germany. So I think we've already done that bit. What I see happening a lot is more direct voice. So where you don't organize as a group and then tell your employer, hey, that's what we want. But probably because of last few years, there has been more labor shortage. I'm a bit hesitant because I think it's currently changing. So our labor market situation is currently changing. So I'm talking about the past few years now. Employees knew they have power because the manager needs you. They won't just find the next guy tomorrow.
Yeah.
So when you leave, then they've got a real problem. So people were more open. They told their opinion in more open ways. And I think that's something that changed because the power changed.
Mhm.
Because especially young people, they knew if I want to find another job, I'll just look for one and I'll have one next week, right? At
Mhm.
the moment, that's changing, especially in the automotive industry. So lots of people are getting laid off, and so it might go back to what it was earlier, but that's what I experienced in the last few years. That it wasn't just organized voice over works councils, but also more individual voice.
Thank you so much. So, how do you think young people engage in developmental activities like advocacy, voting, having meetings or joining meetings where, community matters are being discussed and improvements discussions are also being held.
I think there are different groups of young people when we talk about that. So there's quite a lot of politically active young people and those who also join works councils and work for that. So that's mostly additional time that they invest. I think there's a group that's involved in that, and on the other hand, there's another group that's very disengaged.
Mm.
So every few years there's a large study, and that's what I'm currently thinking about because I don't think you can just talk about young people in a country, right? So
Yeah.
there's that group of people who are very involved, but there's also a large group of people who are very uninvolved, and that's because they're disappointed they didn't get into apprenticeships, and so they're like on the edge of society, and that group's growing larger. And I think those are the ones who might also follow questionable directions,
Mhm.
right? So followership isn't always good. That's what we know from history.
Yeah.
And I think we need to make sure from our educational system that as many young people as possible have the sense that they can have an impact, even if it's in a small community, but so they don't get lost to that, to the system.
Okay, thank you. So my final question, I don't know if there is a structure for teaching leadership in Germany, but then if you think that because of how, diverse in understanding followership is in Germany, how do you think that we can incorporate followership education into the formal and informal sector in Germany for youth?
So what I find very positive in terms of leadership is that when you want to become a vocational educator, so we've got that system where you go to school half of the time and half of the time you are an apprentice in an organization. So it's very common to do that. And I know it's special to our system. And people often join when they're 16, 17, so pretty
Mm,
young.
mm,
And those educators, they have to have a formal education of how to properly do that. And I think those are sometimes better qualified than leaders, managers who got into their positions by being the best in what they do.
mm,
So originally, so they could be an architect or an engineer, and they just get promoted. Whoa, now you're a manager. If they're lucky, their organization offers them some training, but quite often they don't have the time to do that. So they just try and see what comes out of it. So I think for young people, we have that system where they're educated in the organizations, have themselves received very good training. So that's organized, and they get a certificate. And so it's not like you just go there and sit there and then you get the certificate, but you really have to take exams and everything. And I know quite a lot of young people in organizations who then get that training themselves. I think by understanding those essentials of leadership, they also learn something about followership because they then can reflect themselves like, that's why the person did it and that's why it worked with me,
mhm,
right? So they can
mhm.
reflect themselves. And so I think that system of vocational training is something that we have in Germany that adds to learning both leadership and followership.
Wow, sounds good. Thank you so much for sharing. Do you have a final thought on followership? Anything that you think that is fascinating in terms of followership in Germany?
Hmm. I think it's not just in Germany. I think that followership overall is a concept we haven't really explored yet. So we've talked about followership for nearly half an hour now, but what is it actually?
Mm,
So I think it's really interesting to dig a bit deeper, and our language in German offers those different terms, even if they are a bit old-fashioned, but it offers quite a lot of options of what a follower can be. And I think it's important to think about what followers are meant to be and also what leaders are. So for me, is a leader the same as a manager? I would say no. But thinking about that is the first step to understanding leadership and followership, finding your own way of defining it, then acting accordingly. Because if I just say, oh, be a good follower, how are you supposed as a young person to know what that is?
Wow, thank you so much, Mikey. I've had a very wonderful conversation with you. And I think one thing that I've learned here is that, followership is not a concept to be generalized. It is highly contextual. And I like what you said in your closing statement that, being a leader doesn't mean you're a manager. However, some followership research have equated followers to employees. So, there's still a lot of question in terms of what followership is and what followership is not. So thank you so much, Mikey. And I hope that sometime soon we get to have much more conversations about followership in the future.
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Future of Leadership podcast today. If you are here to kindly share, subscribe, leave a review, and follow us across our social media platforms, including Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, all at TYIL. See you in the next episode.